Hello, everybody. My name is Jim Farmer. I am the Outreach Director of GALECA, the Society of LGBTQ Entertainment Critics. Thank you for joining us for a conversation about the HBO docuseries Last Call, when a serial killer stalked queer New York City. We have some special guests today. We have the director, co-creator, Anthony Caronna, co-creator, executive producer, Howard Gertler, and LGBTQ anti-violence advocate, Bea Hanson. Thank you so much for joining us. This is such a incredibly well-made, informative docuseries. So thank you so much for your work in this. I'm going to read a brief description of this, and then we're going to jump into some questions. In the early 1990s, with homophobia and hate crimes on the rise, as the AIDS crisis worsens, a serial killer preys upon gay men in New York City, infiltrating queer nightlife to find his victims. A gripping investigative crime story, Last Call, when a serial killer stalked queer New York City, also dives deeply into the prejudices and attitudes of the times, when deep-rooted biases in the criminal justice system and the media's distorted public perception of the victims undermined the investigation and enabled a brutal killer to prey on a marginalized populace. The complexities of the closet, combined with a long-standing mistrust of law enforcement, further complicated the case. It also highlights the heroic efforts of activists, including the NYC Anti-Violence Project, to force law enforcement to recognize and protect the queer community. Through exclusive archival and first-time interviews with activists, investigators, and family members, Last Call illuminates how the LGBTQ community fought to solve the murders and demand fair treatment of queer crime victims. Their work remains relevant today. Thank you so much, Anthony, Bea, and Howard, for talking to us today.
Of course. Thank you.
Sure thing. So Howard, and Anthony, first of all, what drew you to want to make this?
Howard, do you want to start since it kind of started with you, and then I'll jump in there?
Yeah, I was sent the book in sort of galley form by HBO and our amazing producing partners, Story Syndicate, and Elon Green's book, which I found incredibly gripping. And I thought there was an opportunity to tell a story about who got justice and who didn't, and what the nature is of violence against queer people and what it took. By activists like Bea to fight against that violence and in a larger way. And I know these are difficult conversations to have, but I also felt necessary ones. And it felt like this story, as well as telling the stories of the victims and their loved ones in all the complexity that Elon's book did, but in a visual way, felt really like a special and particular opportunity.
Good.
And I sort of came to the project because Howard asked me to get dinner, and we got dinner, and he told me that he was working on a project with Story Syndicate, who, everybody on that team is amazing. So I was already like very excited about the idea of it. And then he said it was Last Call, and I had actually been sent the pre-publication version of Last Call a year prior by a different company, and they asked me if I would be interested in directing it as a series. And I actually passed on it the first time it came. I read the book and I loved it, but I passed on the project. Mainly because I wasn't really interested in doing true crime. It wasn't really something that I was necessarily excited about doing. And I was also really nervous about the possibility of re-victimizing the queer community. So I just passed on it. And then once Howard and I sat down for a very long dinner and had a conversation about there being an opportunity here to sort of Trojan horse, like a much deeper conversation around anti-queer violence into this true crime story, I was like hooked, and I knew we had to do it. So yeah.
Were you two pretty familiar with the cases that had happened?
I was not. I mean,
yeah,
yeah.
me neither. Yeah. I was familiar with the AVP and the work of the AVP
Yeah.
generally. I was not familiar with this particular case.
Well,
and I was familiar with the townhouse, so
exactly.
I'll leave that there.
Okay. So Bea, about why it was so important for you to get involved?
Yeah, I like Anthony, when you talked about you dropped your idea, I've had in the Anti-Violence Project over time, we've unfortunately had to deal with all kinds of violence against different members of the queer community. And, people have done true crime TV shows about some of them. There's been plays, there's books. And, every time I've been asked, I've said no. And the reason I've said no is because I feel like it's been a very sort of sensationalist way that they've often looked at the queer community, looked at the victims, very much focused on the person who did the crimes. And this was something different. And this is why I said yes, because Howard and Anthony were looking at it at a much different way, and not being a true crime kind of story, but really looking at the community and looking at the victims' lives and how and the impact of the violence on those individuals, their family members, as well as the larger queer community, and gave a real sense of what was going on in the community at that time, and kind of the connection between anti-LGBT violence and the HIV/AIDS crisis, and kind of the larger social structures against creativity in the queer community, and national organizations not funding queer creative stuff. So so it was all in that context that I was really happy to be part of the project.
Great. I heard this quote and it immediately stood out for me. Queer bars were one of the few places where we could come and feel safe, and then all of a sudden everything was taken away. Environment, AIDS was everywhere. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the bar community was really where, and which is I think very different today, but was really where queer community came together. I mean, there are actually lesbian bars then, which there are very few now in the city, and I think the bar scene is where people felt comfortable. Also the LGBT community center. We had community space. And I think, the reality is that like most people in the queer community at that time weren't even making connections. Like Howard said, I wasn't aware of this case. Well, a lot of people weren't either. And especially because of the beginning of the case, really the person who committed these crimes went to places where there was a lot of men who were having sex with men who weren't really identifying as part of the queer community, not entirely, but largely. And it wasn't really until the murders happened in the West Village in a gay bar with somebody who was very out that actually the queer community engaged more, and at the Anti-Violence Project we were able to engage the queer community more and go out and distribute posters and information in a way that the community was responsive.
Anthony and Howard, I want to talk about that a little bit more. The docuseries does such a great job of establishing, a sense of place and what was going on at the time. At the time, there was such uncertainty for a lot of the men who were out visiting bars, not feeling comfortable being who they were. As I mentioned, AIDS was starting to appear, and then you have, police involvement or lack of involvement. Can you sort of paint a picture of what it was like back then for a lot of these men?
Go ahead, Howard.
It's sort of depend on your situation. I mean, one thing that we hope the show illuminated is the closet wasn't a binary space. And so I think for some of them, yes, the gay bars were places where they could, like, they might have had home lives where they were not out to anyone, or maybe they were out to their spouses, but it was complicated, and they would go, when on their business trips, they would go to the gay bars and find community and maybe find a lover. For others, like Michael Sakara, who was like out as a teenager, basically, he was the life of the party in the center of the social life at the bar. And so it really was sort of contextual for, each of the victims.
I think also to the quote that you mentioned earlier, Jim, about the violence sort of shattering the beauty of these queer spaces. I think it was definitely important to Howard and I, but it was important to our entire team to show the beauty of what this violence was destroying. I mean, I think that if we had just sort of jumped into only the violence of this time, you wouldn't be able to see what this violence was completely shattering. And I think from previous work of mine, I had done a lot of work sort of pulling apart and excavating the joyful side of the 80s and 90s queer experience in New York. And so it was easy for me in that first episode, and in especially the third episode, to show the beauty of queer spaces, to show the beauty of queer bars, and you know, kind of what this violence was destroying.
One
I
of the
think
most
part of it wasn't destroying it either. You know, it was
Yeah.
impacting it, but I think it's also where we lived. You know, like this was in the context of HIV/AIDS and people dying. It was in the context of trans communities being targeted. It was it was in this greater context, but we also like had to have community, and we made sure that we had community, and we had, you know, we had joy and love and sex, and all of those things were happening at the same time, and both things
Yeah.
can live together.
You mentioned a little bit earlier some of what you wanted to do and what you didn't want to do, but can you talk a little bit about, there are a lot of interviews in this series. Was there hesitancy for some of these people to talk about this, to you know, go through this again?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There definitely was. Yeah. I mean, I think for many reasons, I think people don't want to relive the trauma of the situation, but I think also, you know, I talk a lot about like having not wanting to do true crime before I directed this. But the truth is that in making this, I saw the opportunity that there is to tell a story in a very like meaningful, deep, impactful way, to really consider every single story point and not just tell the most salacious version of the story. And I think that a lot of people didn't want to sit down because that is the way true crime is often presented to people. And so there was a nervousness, I think, from folks to participate in something that on the outset looks like a very sort of I don't know, a true crime show. Yeah.
For me, one of the most infuriating aspects of all this was the police involvement, or maybe the lack of involvement. But can you sort of talk about, you know, how the police reacted, or how they didn't really do as much as they could and should have done back in the time?
I mean, at the Anti-Violence Project, that's what we faced every single day. You
Seriously.
know, where it was constantly, we were having gay, lesbian, trans people getting beat up and killed, and we didn't have the police response that we thought we needed to have. We had serial attackers out that law enforcement wasn't responding to. So this was all in that kind of larger context. And I think, you know, there was the homophobia was about unresponsiveness. And so in this particular case, you know, the rationale that was given is that these bodies were not found in New York City, even though they were all last seen in New York City. So of course, you know, if you're going to try to investigate and find out somebody's going to do something again, you got to go where they're going to find their next victim, not where the bodies were found. So it was super frustrating. You know, it was super frustrating. And even, you know, watching the film, you know, and Anthony had an interview with law enforcement officers in Pennsylvania, in a little town in Pennsylvania where bodies were found. And, you know, you could see on their pad of paper that they wrote fag bars, you know, because that was part of their investigation. They were going to go look at the fag bars, you know, so it's just, you know, it was just pervasive, and something that we had to deal with every single day. And it was frustrating. And so that's why we did a lot of stuff on our own. You know, we put our own rewards out. We did our own investigation. Like, I have no background in investigating, but I was investigating crime all the time. And that's what we had to do.
I know that, again, it was a mission of you, Anthony Howard, to really highlight the heroic efforts of the activists, including the NYC Anti-Violence Project. But just, I mean, can you just sort of talk about how they sort of picked up the slack for what the police weren't doing at the time?
I mean, I think Bea can probably speak best to it because she was doing the work. Yeah, maybe could we pass that one to Bea, because I think you were
Why doesn't Bea start it and then we can add on?
Yeah, we can throw some lines.
Because Bea lived it. Yeah.
Well, yeah, well, and I think, you know, the film, you know, Howard and Anthony did a great job of getting this archival footage, because there's all this footage that, like, I hadn't either seen at all or seen in years, but really, I think the film did a great job of documenting those things, you know. So, you know, we put out, you know, we were very old, you know, it was the 90s. We were very old school. We had, you know, we had flyers, and we were like week pasting all over the place about there being a serial killer. We posted a reward that one of our board members put up funding for. After that, subsequently, the police ended up posting a reward, but that took us doing it first for them to do anything. We went out to gay bars, you know, and we were out. We had staff people and volunteers who were going out, talking to people. We had a flyer that says, "If you know, do you know about this serial killer?" I mean, and we would hand it out to people, and the film really shows that. And I thought did such a great job of really showing what the community did and what the community does to support each other.
I think a lot about how we actually were just on another panel, and this came up. Bea, at one point in the series, I don't remember where, says that they were crime fighters and the police just wanted to solve a crime, and they weren't really interested in getting to know the community. And unfortunately, a huge part of solving this crime was having to understand the community, and they just did not want to make that effort. They didn't want to understand queer people. They didn't want to go into these queer bars and talk to them. And so a huge key component was missing in solving these crimes, which is, you know, why it went on for years and years and years and years.
Another irony that comes up in this is that Richard Rogers, who was eventually arrested for the crimes in 2001, you know, he really should not have even been on the streets. I mean, can you sort of talk about that, Bea?
I mean, do you guys want to talk about that first? Because you did more of the kind of background stuff on that. So why don't you start? I'll finish this one.
Okay.
Yeah. Howard, you can also talk more to this, but it was really important to us. We had read in the book that in 1973, Richard had killed his college roommate and had used the gay panic defense to get off. And it was important to us to really figure that out and make sure that was exactly how things played out. And after months of research and digging, we found the tape of Richard sort of being, you can see it in the final episode of the show, Richard being arrested for the murder and then using the gay panic defense to get off. And, you know, after this, after 1973, after getting off for, you know, after using the gay panic defense, he goes on to commit all of these murders. So yeah, he should have been in jail. He should have, he should have never been allowed to even be in New York City, let alone be a nurse. And the justice system sort of failed and allowed this to go on.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the main through lines of the show is the way institutionalized homophobia works. And in this case, it was the way that institutionalized homophobia worked within the court system. In 1973, it's the gay panic defense. In 1990, when he was tried for sexually assaulting another man that he had picked up in a gay bar, they used the fatal attraction defense, and they painted the victim as the Glenn Close character in Fatal Attraction, who, you know, at that time was considered the villain. I think that film has sort of been reclaimed and returned a little bit, but they're like, oh, it's just like Fatal Attraction, but it's like what gay guys do. That's kind of what the defense was. And Richard Rodgers was acquitted, and then he murdered Peter Anderson like 18 months later. So this was someone who should never have been out free.
Mhm.
And to top it off, like the thing that kept him free was the way institutionalized homophobia worked within the court system.
And just to add that, the gay panic defense it didn't become illegal in this state until 2020. So that's super
Yeah.
recent that
Yeah.
you can't use a gay panic or trans panic defense.
John and Dan, did you have any questions?
Hey, everybody. John,
Hi.
Executive Director, founder of GALECA, the Society of LGBTQ Entertainment Critics, and our Dorian Awards. I do have a couple of questions. Thanks, Jim. But first, I wanted to ask Daniela if they have any questions.
I do. Thank you. This has been really informative. And while it's heavy stuff, it's really inspiring. Thank you for your work. A couple of things that happened around that time that I feel like tie together what some of our audience at Translash Media might be interested in excavating and watching this and maybe getting some like motivation around the ongoing work to fight for queer and trans lives in this political climate. So two things happened around the time that this film is set. One is Alana Kayla, I might be pronouncing her name wrong, rest in peace. A trans woman was murdered in Manhattan in 1993 with a gunshot wound to her head. There was barely any media coverage at the time. And then, of course, Marsha P. Johnson was also murdered around that time, or, they say it's a suicide, but, the door remains open. And so it's just this pattern, right? The trans panic defense, like Minnesota just finally banned the panic offense like yesterday or whatever. And so it's very clear right now, especially like with Project 2025 looming over our heads, and the Christian right just really being so open about wanting to erase us. And myself as a queer and trans and non-binary person, I'm just wondering, when you think about other queer and trans people watching this film, and then going out into their daily lives, what are some threads that you're seeing being connected here? It's like, it feels like a rehashing of history every day these days. The murder of trans people has more than doubled since 2019. So, and that we're dealing with this death every day and also trying to find joy and hope. Yeah, what would you say to queer and trans people, especially trans folks watching this film, about like, what can we learn from the past that we can apply to the present? Because in the present, we're still dealing with this, right? That would be my first very broad question.
I think that's a great one for B, actually.
Yeah.
To start with, we can add things, but yeah.
Yes.
No, it's a really good question, Danny. And I think, to me, it shows the power of community, because I think, because I look back at that and I think about now, and to your point, of the real kind of, I think the American Medical Association is calling the attacks against trans people as an epidemic, in this country, and especially trans people of color. And I think what we have to do is use it as a way to connect ourselves with each other, and really create that kind of community, because we have a right to be who we are, and we need support to have those rights continue and to exist. And I think it's also like, it's important that we all support organizations like the Anti-Violence Project, and organizations that connect queer people together and support our communities. And so I think it's important for all of us to have that kind of connection in any way that we can, and to be supporting our LGBT brothers and sisters. That's the hope, I think, for me, that comes out of this, because we have hope now too, in terms of, I think, where we've come in terms of being able to get some support for LGBT community. But I think, often we find when we have advances is when people strike out against us, and that's I think often the time when we find that the backlash is the hardest is when we've been making strides. So I think we have to appreciate those strides that we've made and just keep the fight. This stuff is cyclical. It's not like, I feel like, I think there was some sense in the queer community, like back at the end of the 90s and the early 2000s, like, okay, well, if we just have, gay marriage, that's going to somehow like solve something. And none of the stuff that any of the advances that we make solve things. It creates backlashes, and then it just forces us to, keep it moving.
I think also, the final line of the show, I believe the final line of the show is Bea saying, we have a great responsibility to each other as a community, and that's a very joyful thing. And I think that taking joy in the fact that we have a responsibility to each other is like definitely the most profound idea in the entire series. It's like it's not straight people that are supporting me that make me feel better when things are going wrong, or when, this was a very, very emotionally difficult show to make for 2 years. And it was the queer people in my life that were like, we can get through it. We can have conversations. Let's talk about what you're going through, interviewing these people or having these conversations. It's the idea that we are a community and we have a responsibility to hold each other up is, it's a beautiful idea. And it's one that I think about often.
Yeah, I mean, a big question you have whenever you make a show or movie, especially a documentary, is like, what's the takeaway and what do you want your audience to be left with? And I think, Danny, to like your exact question, like that is something that we wanted to address in the show. Is like it is a terrible time. It not only feels like a terrible time, it is a terrible time. And the queer community has faced these terrible times before, and finds power and resolution and resistance in the community and their allies coming together and doing the work. Certainly the work that the queer community is doing now. And I find that to be a very like, and hopefully for me, it feels empowering, and we actually want audiences, especially queer audiences, to come away feeling empowered by the show.
And one thing might be, not just respect your elders, but get to know them in the queer community. They have such history to share that you can learn from. I wanted to ask, and I'm going to, Anthony and Howard, you took great pains to not focus on the killer. This is not the Dahmer approach. Can you speak to the legacy of the victims and just maybe go over what their family members remember about them, and this pays honor to the victims. What would you like to say about some of them, or them in general?
I mean, they were all such complex, different people. And I think the legacy of all of them is that they loved and they had full lives, and they weren't, the summation of their lives wasn't the worst thing that ever happened to them. Like, I think that when I was diving into this show and researching this show, everything that came up about every single victim, all that came up about them was this horrible, horrible thing that ended their lives. And I think that for us, it was important to show that these men lived complex, complicated, loving lives, and they left a trail of people behind them that absolutely adored them and remember them so well, and whose lives were deeply affected by losing them. So I think at the end of the day, it was important to me, it was important to Howard, it was important to our entire team to show these men as fully lived lives, as really complex people, and not just use what happened to them as some sort of fodder for TV.
Look, the media coverage at the time of the crimes were basically like they had it coming, right? That was the tenor of it.
Yeah.
And Anthony Marrero was like, a cherished member of his chosen family of other sex workers, as well as for his family of origin, you know, with a great nephew who also identifies as queer, kind of a missing link that feels really important as someone that, you know, Antonio looks to. For Tom Mulcahy, you know, beloved father, you know, and Tracy thinks about the relationship she didn't get to have with him, and getting to have an understanding of the component of his life, of his gay life that she didn't really know at the time, but, you know, looking back in retrospect, you know, creates a full picture for her that she really cherishes. You know, Peter, we know, was the first lover of Tony Hoyt, you know, and you know, they were in the closet, but for Tony, it was a way to understand this is what it's like to have a loving relationship with another man. And eventually he did find the strength to come out. And Michael Sakara, you know, has a lesbian sister. You know, they were queer siblings and was out from the very beginning. And you know, they all lost something terrible. And what we were hoping the show would do was restore that sort of dignity and love. What we really wanted with these characters was like subjects rather, was we wanted them to be described by the people who love them, which is very different from the way they were sort of treated back at the time of the original crimes.
Thank you all so much for joining us. The docuseries Last Call, When a Serial Killer Stalked Queer New York City is an HBO docuseries also available on Max. Thank you to director, co-creator Anthony Caronna, co-creator, executive producer Howard Gertler, and LGBTQ anti-violence advocate Bea Hanson. Thank you so much for this extraordinary series, and thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Right.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, bye.